It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind where life in the city hums gently in the background. Cars rolled slowly through intersections, the sun hung lazily above glass towers, and the sidewalk pulsed with people heading nowhere fast. Among them, a tall black man in a simple hoodie and jeans strolled down Main Street, holding a coffee in one hand and a paper bag in the other. There was nothing remarkable about him, at least to the average onlooker. But to one patrol officer parked across the street, something about the man just didn't fit. Welcome to Tailcraft, where true stories come alive with every twist and turn. If you're visiting for the first time, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Here's a question for you. What would you do if the very person trained to protect freedom was mistaken for a threat by someone who also wears a uniform? Today's story is not fiction. It's real. And it shook an entire city. As the man crossed the street, the police cruiser's lights suddenly flashed. A sharp chirp of the siren made heads turn. The officer stepped out with a swagger, hand already resting on the sidearm, voice projecting authority before reason. "Hey, you stop right there," he barked. The man paused, confused, not alarmed. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, calm as still water. But the officer wasn't interested in answers. He was driven by assumptions. People began to slow their steps, watching. A woman pulled out her phone and started recording. The man complied with every order. "Put the bag down." He did. Hands visible. They were. ID. The man nodded and reached slowly for his wallet, speaking clearly with each movement. Yet the officer's voice got louder, more aggressive, full of suspicion rather than professionalism. "What are you really doing around here?" he sneered. And just like that, the air shifted. What started as routine escalated into something ugly, something many have seen too often. A black man doing nothing wrong being treated like a criminal. But what the officer didn't know, and what the growing crowd was about to find out, was that this wasn't just any man. Behind that calm demeanor was a warrior. A protector. A Navy SEAL. This story matters not just because it exposes racism, but because it challenges the very systems that let it persist. It forces us to look at the dangers of profiling, even by those sworn to serve and protect. And more importantly, it asks, what happens when you mistake strength for threat? Today you'll witness what happens when dignity doesn't back down, and when the truth walks into injustice and shuts it down cold. So stay with us. The confrontation is just beginning, and the fallout is nothing short of explosive. The tension on the sidewalk thickened. What started as a passing moment had morphed into a public showdown. The officer's posture was rigid now, legs slightly apart, hand hovering near his weapon as if ready for something to pop off. The man across from him, still calm, stood with his hands visible and eyes fixed on the officer, not with fear but with a patience that unnerved the aggressor. This was not his first time being misjudged. But today was going to be different. "Your ID," the officer repeated, this time louder, his tone sharp like a cracked whip. The man slowly pulled out a leather wallet, flicked it open, and held it up without a word. The officer snatched it, glanced at it, and froze. His lips parted, but nothing came out. On the ID, clearly displayed, was the name Chief Petty Officer Marcus J. King, along with the emblem of the United States Navy and the golden trident that marked him as a Navy SEAL. A flicker of doubt passed through the officer's eyes, but pride is a dangerous thing. Instead of apologizing or de-escalating, he doubled down. "So what? I don't know if this is real. People fake these," he said, waving the ID carelessly before pocketing it. That's when murmurs from the growing crowd began. "Did he just take his ID?" someone whispered. "That's a Navy SEAL," another added, recognizing the insignia from a friend who served. King stood firm, still calm. "Officer, with all due respect, I've complied with every order. I'm not under arrest. You've taken my ID and haven't cited a reason for detaining me. Please explain." But logic was a poor match for a fragile ego. "You're in a high crime zone. I saw you acting suspicious," the cop snapped. "Loitering. That's enough reason for me to stop you." At this, King tilted his head slightly, almost in disbelief. "I was walking from the coffee shop to my hotel. My receipts are in that bag you told me to drop. You saw a black man and assumed threat. That's not policing. That's profiling." The officer stepped closer, voice rising. "Watch your mouth. You people think you can pull the race card every time." And that's when it happened. A small woman from the back of the crowd pushed forward, holding up her phone. "It's all on video. Everything." And he never raised his voice. Never resisted. "You took his ID without cause and you're escalating this. You better watch your mouth, officer." That spark lit the crowd. More phones were up now. People were no longer just observers, They were witnesses, recorders, amplifiers. Someone yelled, "What's your badge number?" Another person chimed in, "We've called internal affairs." But King? He remained unmoved. His training kicked in, not the combat side but the discipline, the control, the understanding that real power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply waits. "I served this country for 17 years, he said, his voice finally rising just enough to be heard by all. "I've fought overseas so that citizens back home, black, white, everyone, could walk safely in their own streets. I didn't think I'd be treated like an enemy here, on the sidewalk of the country I risked my life to defend." The officer shifted uncomfortably. The power dynamic had shifted entirely, and he knew it. What had started as a one-sided harassment was now a courtroom on the pavement. The judge? The people? The jury? The footage being captured from a dozen angles. A second police cruiser arrived, called in for backup, though no threat existed. Two officers stepped out, immediately assessing the scene. One of them, older and clearly experienced, recognized Marcus King the moment he approached. "Chief King?" he asked, startled. King nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. That's me. I was stopped, searched, and now detained without cause. I'd appreciate your help getting my ID back." The older officer turned to the younger one, now clearly sweating. "You detained Chief Marcus King? A SEAL? What's your PC, probable cause?" He was loitering, the officer stammered. Looked suspicious. The superior's eyes narrowed. "Walking with a coffee and a bag is not suspicious. And I know Chief King. I served with his commanding officer." "You've made a serious mistake, Officer Blake." Marcus remained silent through the exchange. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. He simply waited. The crowd was still. The phone still recording. Then came the moment of accountability. The superior turned back to Marcus and said, "Chief, we'll file a full report. You'll be given the incident number. And if you'd like to file a formal complaint, I'll personally see to it that it gets processed." The cop who had instigated everything stood speechless, exposed. His authority had melted away in front of everyone, not by force, but by the quiet strength of the man he tried to humiliate. As the crowd began to disperse, a woman approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for your service, and for standing tall. My son's 12. You saw everything. You showed him how to handle hate without hate." Marcus nodded, the weight of years of similar encounters pressing silently on his shoulders. "Tell him that respect starts with self. And that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's strategy." And with that he picked up his bag, retrieved his ID and walked off down the same sidewalk, this time not alone. The crowd didn't follow him, but they stood still for a moment longer, watching a real hero disappear into the city's rhythm, their hearts stirred, their minds awakened. The tension in the room was thick, so thick you could cut it with a knife. The crowd in the coffee shop had fallen eerily silent. All eyes were now on the black man who, just moments earlier, had been barked at and humiliated by the aggressive white police officer. Nobody had come to his defense, at least not yet. But then something happened. The man's demeanor shifted from calm and reserved to something else entirely. His eyes sharpened. His body subtly straightened. This wasn't the posture of an average citizen. It was the poise of someone who had been trained under pressure. Someone who had survived things this cop couldn't even begin to imagine. The officer, still unaware of the ticking time bomb he just activated, barked again. "I said show me some ID now." The man didn't flinch. Instead, he calmly reached into his wallet and pulled out a card. But it wasn't just a driver's license. He held out a military ID, thick, official, undeniable. The kind that bears a seal. The cop glanced at it and instantly paused. His lips parted slightly but no words came out. It was as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. That card wasn't just military, it had a designation that struck like lightning. Commander Derek J. Wallace. U.S. Navy SEAL. Special Warfare Command. That was all it took. The moment the badge was seen by a nearby veteran seated at one of the corner tables, the man rose to his feet and saluted sharply. "Sir," he said aloud, voice steady. The silence shattered. A woman in line gasped. The coffee shop manager took a slow step backward. And the police officer, suddenly pale, stood frozen, mouth open, caught in a nightmare of his own making. He'd just harassed a Navy SEAL officer. Not just any SEAL but Commander Derek Wallace, a man who had led covert missions in Iraq, carried out humanitarian rescues, and had been honored by 2 presidents for his valor. A living legend. And the officer had barked at him like a stray dog. The mood flipped on a dime. What had begun as a moment of racial profiling had now spiraled into a public relations disaster for the officer, and possibly the department. Commander Wallace's calm hadn't changed, but his voice carried more weight now, more authority. "You've profiled me," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Without cause, without warrant. Do you know what that means, officer?" The cop, still unable to form a coherent reply, nodded weakly. He didn't have to say a word. His face said everything. "Let me remind you of something," Wallace continued. "My uniform might not be visible today, but I wear it every day in service. That means I serve people like you, even when they don't serve people like me." The words sliced through the silence like a blade. The crowd erupted into claps, not a roaring applause but something deeper. Respect. Vindication. Justice beginning to surface. Someone had started recording, of course. The video was already trending. The footage captured everything: the aggression, the silence, the shift, the reveal. And that name, Commander Derek Wallace, was already lighting up search engines. Twitter. TikTok. Every comment thread carried the same sentiment. He handled it with dignity. The cop didn't deserve that much grace. But the story wasn't over. Not even close. The aftermath unfolded quickly. Within an hour of the video going live, it had already amassed tens of thousands of views. By nightfall, it was everywhere, from major social media platforms to cable news segments. People were outraged not just because a hero had been humiliated, but because it reflected a pattern that black veterans and civilians alike knew far too well. And yet, something was different this time. The man at the center wasn't a passive victim. He was a warrior who had survived the harshest terrains and walked away from explosive encounters around the world. Now, back home, he had been ambushed with suspicion in a coffee shop. The irony was bitter. The local police department was under fire. The officer in question, now identified as Patrolman Greg Donnelly, had a history, unfiled complaints, minor misconduct swept under the rug, and now this. But this time there was video. Clear audio. A national hero involved. Commander Wallace hadn't filed charges, yet. But he had issued a formal report, backed by military attorneys. The pressure was building. Wallace hadn't said much to the media, except for one striking quote during a brief press appearance. "I fought for this country so that no one would be judged by the color of their skin. Apparently, my uniform doesn't follow me off duty." That statement rocked the system. Veterans around the country rallied behind him. Black servicemen and women shared their own stories of being treated as second-class citizens once they stepped out of uniform. Public figures weighed in, some sharing outrage, others calling for reforms within local law enforcement agencies. News outlets replayed the coffee shop video on a loop. It wasn't just about a mistake. It was about a culture that allowed these kinds of encounters to be routine. One morning encounter had cracked open a national conversation, and Wallace was now the reluctant face of it. The Navy remained silent publicly but made it known that Wallace's record was impeccable, and that he had their full confidence. Meanwhile, Patrolman Donnelly was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The department spokesperson fumbled through a statement about evaluating the context, but the damage was done. Wallace hadn't yelled. He hadn't resisted. He hadn't escalated. And still he'd been treated like a criminal. The story gained another wave of attention when a group of active duty SEALs released a video of their own. Masked faces, distorted voices, but their message was chillingly clear: "You messed with one of us. That won't be forgotten." It wasn't a threat, it was solidarity. Brotherhood. And the public ate it up. Amid the chaos, Wallace continued to operate with poise. He visited a local high school and spoke to a group of black teenage boys, telling them, "You're not invisible. You matter. Even when the world acts like you don't." He emphasized the power of staying calm under pressure, the strength in knowing your worth. When asked by a young student why he didn't fight back physically, Wallace smiled. "Because I don't fight battles that aren't worth it. I stand on truth. That's enough to break walls." The room went silent. Those boys didn't just hear him, they felt him. By the end of the week, the mayor had issued a public apology to Wallace. The police chief, under pressure from the city council and several veteran organizations, resigned. Donnelly's badge was quietly revoked, and though no formal charges were pressed, his name was now forever tied to one of the most disgraceful public incidents caught on tape. Commander Wallace hadn't just exposed one man's racism. He'd held a mirror up to a system and forced it to look. Without shouting. Without revenge. Just with the truth, a calm voice, and a name that demanded respect. In the weeks that followed, Commander Wallace returned to his normal duties, but normal had changed forever. Strangers greeted him in airports, some saluting, others simply placing a hand over their heart. Parents brought their children to meet him during public appearances. The incident that was meant to demean him had, instead, elevated his story into a beacon. But for Wallace it was never about fame. "I didn't need to go viral," he told a reporter. "I needed people to remember who we say we are as a nation, and start living up to it." He knew the spotlight would eventually fade, but what mattered was the impact left behind, like footprints in wet cement, slow to fade, impossible to ignore. He used the platform wisely. Within 2 months, Wallace helped launch a program called Shield and Honor, aimed at building trust between minority communities and veterans transitioning into civilian life. The initiative hosted workshops, school visits, and even partnered with local law enforcement departments that wanted to retrain officers with cultural sensitivity modules. Wallace wasn't there to demonize all police. He knew some of them had served beside him in war. But he demanded accountability. Respect wasn't optional, it was earned. And for those who abused power, Wallace made it clear, "We'll call you out. And we won't be quiet about it." In one televised panel, a retired general teared up while recalling Wallace's career and the meaning of that coffee shop moment. "He didn't just serve with honor overseas. He reminded us of how to lead with it back home." The comment went viral, but it also made its way into history books. Several universities added Wallace's experience to social justice curricula. Documentaries were proposed. A movie deal was even in the works, though Wallace joked, "Just don't cast someone too pretty, I don't want people to get the wrong idea." The room laughed, but beneath the humor there was a truth. Wallace's story mattered, not because he was perfect, but because it proved that dignity under pressure still existed in this divided world. Donnelly faded from headlines, but the systems that enabled his behavior did not. Thanks to Wallace's advocacy and community pressure, that local police department rewrote its training protocol and introduced a veteran liaison board. For the first time, former military members were helping review misconduct cases, bringing fairness and clarity into a process long plagued by silence. Change was slow, but it was real. Wallace never gloated. When asked what justice looked like to him, he replied simply, "Justice is when my nephew never has to ask me why a cop looked at him like he's dangerous." That kind of justice, he knew, would take more than one video. One evening, standing on the deck of a Navy vessel during a retirement ceremony, Commander Wallace addressed a crowd of officers, recruits, and civilians. He looked over the sea of faces and said, "Every day you carry your country with you, whether in uniform or not. And every day the world will test you on what that truly means. Be ready. Be proud. But most of all, be decent." The crowd stood in silence before erupting into applause. It wasn't just about one man anymore, it was about all of us. About remembering that sometimes, the quietest resistance, the calmest dignity, is the most powerful legacy of all.